Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is U.S. Immigration Attorney Hardam Tripathi from Trip Law. We're a law firm based out of Lakeland, Florida, and today we're going to talk about how to expedite your USCIS application. So there's numerous ways to actually speed up and expedite your USCIS application so that you can ultimately get your just desserts, your immigration benefit, and ultimately live that American dream. So what are some ways to actually go about ultimately expediting this application? Well, the first way is something called premium processing. Premium processing is basically a fee that you can pay to USCIS. It's about $12.25 and it can vary. Filing fees are subject to change, but you can pay a certain amount of money to ultimately get your application on the top and ultimately get it processed within 15 calendar days. So this is a really great way if the option is provided based on the type of application you are ultimately applying for. It is a great way to ultimately speed up your application and get that immigration benefit. Premium processing is a way for USCIS to ultimately have some money that they take from the applicant to help speed up your application process and for your application to go on top so that you can then ultimately speed up that whole process. So instead of waiting maybe 6 to 8 months, you can do it within 15 calendar days and be quicker with respect to that application. Another way you can do a really good job at expediting your application is to avoid requests for evidence. These are called RFEs. By doing that, you ultimately shorten the time it takes for your application to go through the USCIS system. So usually when you submit all your documents, usually the government, the USCIS, will want you to submit more documentation through what is called a request for evidence, an RFE. However, if you provide more documentation, more thorough documentation on the front end, and by providing more documents and giving them more than what is necessary at times, then you actually speed up your application process because you limit the amount of RFEs or requests for evidence that could be issued to you as the applicant. So usually when you are applying for some sort of immigration benefit, maybe a green card or naturalization, for example, for citizenship purposes, you want to make sure you're providing all the documentation that is needed in a thorough manner. So basically providing, if it's 1 year of tax history, you want to provide 3 years of tax history so that you're not getting an RFE later down the road saying we still need 2 more years of tax paperwork. So ultimately, trying to provide thorough supporting documentation is a very key element to ultimately making sure that you are expediting your USCIS application. Another way is to ultimately do what is called a service request. Service requests are basically something that you do. It's where you reach out to USCIS and you basically tell them that you would like to have your process expedited through a service request, but the caveat to that, the rule is that you do have to allow them to have that time it does take to actually process the application. So if the average time is 6 to 8 months, after 8 months have passed, you can then apply for what is called a service request to USCIS to ultimately expedite that application and make sure your application does get sped up because that allotted time now has passed for USCIS to do their job. So now you as the applicant can humbly request a service request to USCIS so your application can be ultimately expedited. Now, another thing you want to do is Congressional Inquiry. A lot of times we have applicants who come in and their application is slowed down through the bureaucratic nature of what USCIS does in terms of all these paperwork and review times and COVID backlogs and things of that nature. Well, you can actually reach out to your congressional member, your House of Representatives member who's in your district can ultimately be a great asset in terms of speeding up your request. Ultimately, if you look at it, USCIS and the Department of Homeland Security has to report to Article 1 Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate, and ultimately they have to provide an update, right, usually during congressional hearings and whatnot. However, you as that applicant do have that right through a congressional inquiry to reach out to your Congress member and ask he or she basically to with their case manager to ultimately reach out to that agency, USCIS, and ultimately speed up that application or find out what pitfalls are stopping your application from going through the process in a time that's considered to be reasonable. So congressional inquiries are a really great help, and we at our law firm have great contacts with our congressional members to make sure that we can go ahead and speed up your application process so that your immigration dream can be lived sooner rather than later. Another thing that you can do is you can do a expedited request with USCIS, and this is only offered if premium processing is not an option. So this is usually a type of way to expedite your process through what is called an expedite request, and we'll provide some links below to show you kind of how you can go about doing that. But these are expedite requests where premium processing is not an option, but there are certain factors that ultimately lead you to have to do that expedited request. So this could be that you as that person or your business, if you're applying for like some sort of business visa or some sort of employment-based rationale, then ultimately if you're going to suffer financial harm as that business or that individual, then you can actually apply for what is called an expedited request through USCIS. Basically, the goal of this is to limit the amount of financial harm that will take place if your application is caught up in processing. So very important that you do request that expedite request to USCIS if your application is caught up in processing, because you don't want to suffer any financial harm due to the prolongment of your application. Another way is if there's like a humanitarian emergency. If you were someone seeking humanitarian relief, and if there was some sort of humanitarian type of disaster that could have occurred to your application or to you as that individual, if this application is not timely processed, then that is another way you can actually request expedited processing from USCIS. So this is another great way. We have a lot of clients who are Afghans currently who are trying to get assistance, and they want to expedite their process because of either persecution from the Taliban or from another type of entity, a governmental entity that's providing them some sort of persecution. Well, that's obviously a humanitarian type of effort that we want to make sure our clients don't have to wait longer and ultimately suffer that persecution. So humanitarian reasons can be a way to ultimately process your application quicker through the expedited process through USCIS. Another reason is if there's a governmental interest. If there is some sort of government interest for your application to be processed quicker so that it helps the United States of America, this is another means to expedite your application, because ultimately if your application is prolonged, then the government will actually end up suffering. So as a result, your application needs to be expedited so that the governmental interest is made. And then finally, if there's any sort of significant USCIS error, we all know that these are people who are processing your application, and sometimes errors do occur with these USCIS agency. And so if you do have some sort of significant error, and let's say there's a long time that has happened, a long time has passed, and your application is still stuck in processing, then ultimately you can request expedited type of processing from USCIS to get this done so that that significant error is reduced and your application does go through the pipeline so that you can then ultimately get your immigration benefit. So today we've really discussed ways to expedite and speed up your process with USCIS if your application has slowed down. If you are experiencing that, please reach out to us. Please reach out to a lawyer, Trip Law. We'd be more than happy here to help you. We can either do that congressional inquiry for you, we can do the expedited processing, we can figure out whether you want to do premium processing. Because remember, with premium processing, even if you file and you later decide to do premium processing, you still do have that right. So premium processing is also a great way. We can make sure that we provide all the documents so you're limiting the amount of RFEs, and we can also do a lot of service requests for you. So ultimately, there are many ways to speed up your application. We want to make sure that we get you your immigration benefits sooner rather than later. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to assisting you with your immigration journey.